This seat isn't for people who smell like that. The woman's voice sliced through the cabin of the airplane like a knife, freezing every conversation mid-sentence. Heads turned, eyes locked on the source of the commotion. A silver-haired man, quiet and unassuming, clutched the brim of his faded Vietnam veteran cap and bowed his head. Shame crept across his weathered face like a slow-moving storm. Not a single person spoke up for him. Not one voice rose in defense. A nearby flight attendant, all professionalism but no compassion, gestured toward the back of the plane. "Sir," she said, expression unreadable, "we have seats available near the restrooms." And then, breaking the tension like a crack of thunder, the pilot's voice rang out over the intercom. "We're stopping this aircraft immediately." A pause gripped the plane in a collective gasp. When the cockpit doors swung open and the captain himself stepped into the aisle, every passenger seemed to hold their breath. Type respect if you believe every veteran deserves dignity, not humiliation. Meet Walter Hughes, 74 years old, seated quietly in 14B alone. Clad in the same olive green jacket he had worn for over a decade, his presence was nearly invisible. Until that moment. But Walter hadn't always been a forgotten old man lost in a crowd of impatient travelers. 43 years ago, he was something else entirely. A shadow in the jungle. A whisper on the wind. A man known only by his call sign. Ghost Walker. Walter served as a reconnaissance specialist in Vietnam, part of an elite unit that dropped behind enemy lines to rescue stranded American soldiers. For 6 unforgiving years, he carried nothing but a compass, a knife, and an unwavering commitment to bring every man home alive. He moved like a ghost through dense jungle, undetected for days at a time, tracing routes that existed only in his memory and etched them into life-saving maps. Walter extracted 47 soldiers from certain death, 47 men who returned to their families because one man refused to leave them behind. Today, there were no medals pinned to his chest. No accolades followed him through airports. The walls of his small Colorado apartment were bare, save for one single frame resting on a kitchen table. Inside it, a letter. Faded, handwritten, and full of love. My dearest Walter, if the world ever forgets who you are, just remember, I never will. You saved so many sons. That means other mothers got to hold their boys again. That makes you my hero forever. Love, Margaret. Margaret had been gone since 2012. Cancer. Her absence left Walter more alone than ever. She had been the only person left who truly saw him. Not as an old man, not as a relic, but as Walter Hughes, the hero, the husband, the soul behind the silence. Each week, Walter made the same journey. A budget flight from Colorado to Florida, the cheapest ticket he could find. He'd sit beside her grave, tell her about his week, and feel human again for a few precious minutes. That conversation with Margaret was the only one that truly mattered anymore. His cap, the one now being ridiculed, was his most treasured belonging. A simple, sun-faded baseball cap embroidered with Vietnam veteran first in, last out, 1969. It had been a gift from Tommy Rodriguez, Walter's best friend and fellow soldier who never made it home. Tucked inside the inner band was a tiny piece of paper, stitched there by Walter's own hand. A copy of Tommy's final letter to his mother, which Walter had delivered 43 years ago. And yet, he still carried that copy with him, always. To most, Walter was just another elderly man in thrift store clothes. They never saw the Purple Heart hidden in his dresser drawer. They never knew about the nightmares, the ones where Tommy's voice still cried out for help in the darkness. The world had moved on from Vietnam and from the men who had fought its cruel battles. Walter never asked for recognition. No parades, no thanks. He simply wanted to visit his wife and fly home in peace. Apparently, even that was too much to ask. As the businessman in 14A clicked loudly on his laptop, and the woman in 14C swiped through her phone with perfectly manicured fingers, Walter pulled a photograph from his wallet. Margaret, beaming in her wedding dress, looking at the camera with unfiltered joy. "Another week, sweetheart," he whispered to her image. "Almost there." He had no idea that within minutes, his quiet dignity would be assaulted. His presence made a spectacle in front of 100 strangers, and that the cap he wore so humbly would become the flashpoint for a confrontation that would ripple far beyond the cabin of that airplane. Walter Hughes, ghost walker, who had once saved 47 American lives, was about to need rescuing himself from a cruelty that now came not from enemy fire, but from a society that had forgotten the meaning of service. It started with a cough. Subtle. Nothing dramatic. Just the dry kind of cough that lingers after years of jungle humidity, of foxholes filled with damp smoke and whispered commands. Walter sat in 14C, quietly studying the photo of his wife, when the sound escaped him. The woman in 14B snapped her head toward him, her expression curdling into disdain. She was all sharp edges and expensive jewelry, diamond ring glinting under cabin lights, her suit crisp and tailored. "Excuse me," she said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "That's unsanitary." Startled, Walter covered his mouth. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Excuse me," he said softly. But the apology only seemed to feed her contempt. She took a long, slow inventory of him, his old jacket, scuffed shoes, weathered hands, and her lips curled into something cruel. Raising her hand like she was hailing a servant, she called, "Flight attendant?" A young woman hurried over, blonde, efficient, wearing a tight, professional smile that looked freshly trained. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" The woman jabbed her manicured finger in Walter's direction like he was evidence in a courtroom. "This gentleman has a hygiene issue. He's coughing. I can't sit next to someone who—" She paused for dramatic effect. "And smells like he hasn't bathed in days." The word struck Walter like a slap. His face flushed. Every passenger within 6 rows turned to stare. "Ma'am, Walter began, voice thin as paper. "Uh-huh. Look at him," she continued, louder now, her performance growing bolder with each word. "Those clothes look like they came from a thrift store. That ridiculous hat. He probably doesn't even have a real ticket. Probably just some charity case or homeless guy talked his way onto the plane." Across the aisle, a businessman glanced up and chuckled. "Yeah." Walter looked down at the cap in his lap, the one Tommy gave him, the one that had seen 47 men home. He said nothing, just sat in silence, holding on to a piece of who he was, while the rest of the world tried to tear it away. And yet, what no one realized was this: the pilot had heard everything. "This isn't Greyhound, buddy," someone muttered as a mother with 2 young children physically turned her kids away from Walter. "Don't stare, honey," she whispered to her daughter, but just loud enough for Walter to hear. "It's not polite to look at people like that." The flight attendant returned, her smile now thinner, her politeness mechanical. She was young, fresh-faced, probably someone who had never known hardship, never truly understood what sacrifice looked like. She glanced at Walter with barely concealed irritation. "Sir," she said with strained courtesy, "we do have other seating available. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in one of our back rows near the restrooms. It might be more appropriate." Walter's hands trembled as he clutched his Vietnam veteran cap tighter. That cap, once a symbol of pride, of honor, of his connection to the best parts of himself, now felt like a mark of shame. He swallowed hard. I have a paid ticket," he said softly. "I'm just trying to visit my wife's grave." "How sad," the woman in 14B replied with mock sympathy. "But your personal problems don't give you the right to make the rest of us uncomfortable." From behind them, an elderly man leaned forward, his voice low and annoyed. "Young man, maybe you should just move. Some of us are trying to have a peaceful flight." Walter slowly began to rise, his body aching with more than age. His movements were heavy, deliberate, his dignity crumbling with every passing second. As he reached for his small carry-on, his cap slipped from his trembling fingers and dropped to the floor. He bent down, his knees stiff, back straining. A teenager near the window snickered and nudged his friend. "Dude, that old guy's probably gonna pass out. This is so awkward." Nobody moved to help him. Nobody picked up the cap. Nobody asked if he was okay. It was as if the entire cabin had agreed that Walter Hughes no longer mattered. Walter finally retrieved his cap, and as he stood, he caught his reflection in the airplane window. What he saw wasn't the ghost walker, the hero of 47 lives saved. He saw what they saw. An old man, alone, worn, forgotten. The flight attendant pointed down the aisle with quiet urgency. "Sir, your new seat is 31F near the lavatory. I think you'll find it much more suitable." And so began his silent walk of shame. Bag in one hand, cap in the other, he made his way down the narrow aisle. Eyes followed him, some with discomfort, others with smug curiosity, like spectators watching someone else's humiliation unfold. A businessman muttered to his seatmate, "Airlines really need better screening for passengers." A woman typed furiously on her phone, no doubt live texting the drama to friends. A child asked innocently, "Daddy, why is that man so dirty?" The father hushed him quickly. "Shh, don't ask about people like that." People like that? As if Walter's decades of sacrifice, his 47 missions, his Purple Heart, and his undying love for Margaret meant nothing. Because his clothes were worn and his cough inconvenient. Walter reached seat 31F at last, the very back of the plane, right next to the bathroom. The scent of disinfectant and fuel mixed with the steady drone of engines. He sank into the seat, placed his hat in his lap, and stared at his own hands. Scarred, weathered, strong ones, but now shaking slightly. For the first time in 43 years, Walter Hughes felt truly invisible. But there was one person who hadn't looked away. Unbeknownst to the rest of the passengers, one of the flight attendants had been watching everything. Not with disdain, not with apathy, but with something else. Something sharper. Anger. Real, unfiltered anger. This flight attendant didn't turn back to work. He turned and walked straight toward the cockpit. Walter remained in 31F, lost in thought, trying to will himself smaller. The sound of the bathroom door opening and closing only reinforced the message. "This is where you belong." He pulled out Margaret's photo again, her face radiant with the smile he loved so dearly. Tears welled up in his eyes. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," he whispered. "I know you always said I was your hero, but I don't feel like much of anything right now." That's when the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rhodes speaking. We are making an unscheduled stop on the tarmac. Please remain in your seats. We have an urgent matter to address." The plane began to slow, wheels kissing the tarmac, then came to a complete stop, still far from the terminal. Murmurs spread through the cabin like wildfire. "What's happening?" "Mechanical issues." "I have a meeting." The woman from 14B groaned. "This better not take long. I have important business in Miami." But then, the unexpected happened. The cockpit door opened. Assa. And out stepped a tall man in full captain's uniform. Not a flight attendant, not airport staff, but the captain. Distinguished, silver-haired, ramrod-straight posture. The unmistakable presence of someone who had worn a military uniform with pride. Captain Daniel Rhodes, United States Air Force, retired. 23 years of service. 2 tours in Afghanistan. 1 in Iraq. Now flying commercial, but always a soldier at heart. He didn't walk toward first class. He didn't glance at business class. He walked down that narrow aisle with quiet purpose. Not fast, not slow, just steady, until he reached the back of the plane. Until he stood before seat 31F. The passengers watched, silent, breath caught in their throats. Walter looked up, startled, confused. Captain Rhodes stood at attention. "Mr. Walter Hughes," he said, voice strong and clear. I'm Captain Daniel Rhodes, United States Air Force, retired. My flight attendant informed me of your presence on this aircraft. Walter blinked, unsure. Sir, I didn't do anything wrong. I have a ticket. I was just... Mr. Hughes, Captain Rhodes interrupted, his voice softening but steady. 43 years ago, you saved the life of my father. The cabin went silent. Not a word. Not a breath. Staff Sergeant Michael Rhodes, 1st Cavalry Division, March 15, 1971. He was separated from his team near the Cambodian border during a firefight, lost, wounded. 3 days, no radio, no food. He had a bullet in his leg. Walter's eyes widened. The memory rose from deep within, foggy, but still burning bright. You found him, the captain continued. You carried him 8 miles through enemy jungle to an extraction point. You saved his life. Which means, sir, you gave me mine. Because without you, I wouldn't be standing here. I wouldn't even be alive. Slowly, Captain Rhodes removed his pilot's cap. He held it at his side, a symbol of deep respect. My father talked about you until the day he died last year. Walter Hughes, the ghost walker, the man who brought 47 soldiers home, the man who never left anyone behind. Tears flowed freely down Walter's cheeks now, but they were no longer born of shame. They were tears of remembrance, of worth, of being seen, truly seen. Captain Rhodes reached out his hand. Sir, he said, on behalf of every soldier you rescued, on behalf of my father, and on behalf of the country you served with honor, I would be proud if you'd take my seat in the cockpit crew row. It's the least I can do. Walter stared at him, overwhelmed. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came, only a trembling nod. And as Walter rose slowly from seat 31F, the entire cabin, from row 1 to the very last seat, stood. One by one, without cue or command, they rose to their feet. The businessman who had chuckled, the teenager who had snickered, even the woman in 14B, they all stood. And for the first time in decades, Walter Hughes didn't feel invisible. He felt honored. He felt remembered. He felt like someone who mattered, because he always had. And finally, the world remembered. Sir, would you please allow me to escort you to first class? Captain Rhodes said, his voice reverent and steady. It would be my honor. Walter blinked in disbelief. The woman from 14B had gone pale, her mouth slightly ajar, her eyes wide with the dawning realization of exactly who she had humiliated. But Captain Rhodes wasn't done. He turned to address the entire cabin, and when he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable weight of military command. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, I want you to meet a real American hero. He paused, letting the silence deepen the weight of his words. This man served 6 years in Vietnam. He voluntarily went behind enemy lines to rescue stranded soldiers. He brought 47 men home to their families. His tone shifted. Harder now, more pointed. This man has earned every comfort, every courtesy, and every bit of respect we can possibly show him. And anyone who thinks otherwise. He scanned the passengers, locking eyes with the few who had watched Walter's humiliation in silence. Frankly, they don't deserve to share the same air that he breathes. A heavy silence hung over the plane. Then, from somewhere in the middle rows, a single clap rang out. Another followed, then another. Within seconds, the entire cabin erupted into thunderous applause, the kind that shakes metal and memory. A young soldier in uniform, who had been sleeping in row 18, stood immediately at attention and offered a crisp salute. Thank you for your service, sir, the young man said, voice steady with emotion. An elderly woman made her way down the aisle, her eyes filled with tears. My brother served in Vietnam, she said softly. He didn't make it home. Thank you for bringing so many others back to their families. And even the businessman who had earlier muttered about better passenger screening approached with his head bowed. Sir, I'm deeply sorry. I was completely out of line. Please forgive me. But perhaps the most powerful moment came from a child. A little girl, no more than 7, walked up to Walter, clutching something in her small hand. She held it out to him, a tiny American flag pin from her backpack. My daddy says heroes keep us safe, she said simply, placing the pin in Walter's hand. Thank you for keeping us safe. Walter knelt down slowly to her level, his voice barely holding together. What's your name, sweetheart? Emma. Well, Emma, heroes like your daddy are the reason old soldiers like me gotta come home. You tell him I said thank you, okay? Captain Rhodes gently took Walter's arm and personally escorted him to seat 2A. First class, window view, extra legroom, the kind of seat where clouds looked like kingdoms and blue skies stretched forever. As Walter settled in, he placed his weathered Vietnam veteran cap gently in his lap. But this time, it wasn't a source of shame. It was a badge of honor. One that finally, blessedly, meant something again. The woman from 14B tried to approach, apology heavy on her tongue. But Captain Rhodes stepped in, his voice polite but unyielding. Ma'am, he said, I think you've said enough for one flight. As the engines hummed and the aircraft returned to its journey, Walter looked out the window at the endless sky he had once fought to protect. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. He didn't feel like an old man taking up space. He felt like Walter Hughes again, the ghost walker, the man who never left anyone behind. And finally, someone hadn't left him behind either. What happened next transformed that routine flight into something extraordinary. For the remaining 2 hours to Miami, Walter Hughes became the most honored passenger in the history of commercial aviation. The flight attendants, many of whom had earlier looked at him with discomfort or irritation, now practically tripped over one another trying to serve him. Extra blankets, premium snacks, coffee refills, but more than that, they listened. Tell us about the Ghost Walker missions, asked Sarah, the young flight attendant who had once tried to relocate him to the back of the plane. Her eyes were rimmed with tears, guilt, and admiration blended in her expression. Walter, seated in first class, with his cap proudly displayed on the tray table, told stories he hadn't shared in decades. His voice was calm, steady, but every word carried weight. We called it bringing the boys home, he said quietly. Didn't matter if they were conscious or not, wounded or healthy, officer or enlisted. If they were American, they were coming home. A small crowd gathered in the aisle and surrounding seats, passengers who had earlier ignored him now hanging on every word. One older man stepped forward, introduced himself as Robert Chen, a Korean War veteran. You, brother? Chen said, gripping Walter's hand. I know what it's like to come home to silence. Thank you for your service, and thank you for showing all of us what honor really looks like. But the most touching moment came once again from little Emma, who returned to Walter's seat holding her mother's hand. Her mother knelt beside him, tears streaking her cheeks. Sir, she said, voice trembling, my husband is deployed in Afghanistan right now, Army Special Forces. Does the same kind of dangerous missions you used to do. Would you mind if I took a photo of you with Emma? I want to send it to him, so he knows what a real hero looks like. Walter swallowed hard. Sweetheart, he said softly. I'd be honored. Emma climbed onto his lap, both of them holding small American flags. The Vietnam veteran cap was clearly visible in the frame. The picture, once posted online, would be shared thousands of times. A simple caption would appear below it. This is what American heroes look like. The businessman from earlier returned, this time with sincerity and humility. Sir, he said, I need to apologize again. I was raised better than that. My grandfather served in World War II. He would be ashamed of how I acted. Walter looked up, eyes kind. Son, we all make mistakes. What matters is learn from them. Even more powerful were the parents who now encouraged their children to come meet Walter. The same people who had once turned their kids' faces away were now lifting them up, walking them down the aisle. This is Mr. Walter, one father explained gently. He's the kind of brave man who made it possible for us to live safely. A boy, no older than 10, looked at Walter with wide eyes. Are you like a superhero? Walter chuckled softly. No, son, I'm just a soldier who did his job. That's what makes you a superhero, the boy replied, his words cutting straight to the soul with the unfiltered wisdom only children possess. As the plane began its descent into Miami, Captain Rhodes made one final announcement over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, it has been my absolute honor to fly alongside Mr. Walter Hughes today. This man represents the very best of American values: courage, sacrifice, and service above self. Let's show him our appreciation one more time. The applause that followed was not the polite kind. It was thunderous, heartfelt, raw. It was respect, real, earned, overdue respect. The kind Walter Hughes had earned 43 years ago and was finally receiving today. When the wheels touched down and the plane taxied to the gate, something remarkable happened. Not one passenger stood up. Not one person reached for their bags. Every single traveler remained in their seat, quietly, respectfully, waiting, until Walter Hughes was ready to leave the aircraft. And when he did, the aisle parted for him like a hero's parade. Because that day, in seat 31F, the world remembered what honor looked like. And his name was Walter Hughes. They gave him a standing ovation as he walked down the aisle, the same aisle where just hours earlier he had endured his walk of shame. But this time, Walter Hughes wasn't shuffling forward as some forgotten old man. He stepped off that plane as a hero, exactly what he had always been, but what he had somehow forgotten. That is, until 200 strangers reminded him. Here's the truth, the kind that stays with you long after this story ends. Walter Hughes was the same man when he boarded that flight as he was when he stepped off. Same worn jacket, same weathered hands, same quiet, humble demeanor. What changed wasn't Walter. What changed was how people chose to see him. And there are heroes walking among us right now. They're sitting in coffee shops, standing in grocery store lines, living quietly in apartments where no one knows their names, their sacrifices, or the stories behind their silence. They're not wearing uniforms anymore. They don't carry signs that say, I saved lives or I served my country. They're just there, invisible to a world that's forgotten how to recognize true valor. Maybe it's the elderly man at the bus stop who served in Korea. Maybe it's the quiet woman at church who was a Navy nurse in Vietnam. Maybe, just maybe, it's your own grandfather, whose Purple Heart sits forgotten in a dusty drawer. How many Walter Hughes moments have we missed? How many times have we judged someone by their age, their appearance, their clothes, or status, never realizing we were standing in the presence of greatness? The woman in seat 14B didn't become cruel overnight. Cruelty doesn't show up all at once. It creeps in through 1,000 small decisions. Choosing comfort over compassion, convenience over kindness, judgment over understanding. But here's what gives me hope. Captain Rhodes didn't hesitate. Not for a second. He didn't need a reason or permission to honor Walter Hughes. Because real recognizes real. Honor recognizes honor. And when you've lived with integrity, you can see it in someone else like a beacon. The children on that plane learned more about heroism in 2 hours than most adults learn in a lifetime. They learned that heroes don't always look like movie stars or wear shiny medals. Sometimes they look like your grandfather, sitting quietly with a faded cap and memories that could fill 1,000 books. They learned that heroism isn't about fame, fortune, or recognition. It's about sacrifice, humility, service above self. So here's your challenge. Stop walking past the Walter Hughes in your life. Stop assuming that the quiet ones have nothing important to say. Stop judging people by their packaging instead of their character. Start listening. Start honoring. Start noticing. Because the most extraordinary people often live the most ordinary lives. Somewhere right now, there's a ghost walker sitting alone, wondering if anyone still remembers what he sacrificed. For strangers, he'll never meet. Don't let him sit in silence. Don't let him fade away. Share this story if you believe that silence in the face of disrespect makes you part of the problem. And if this message resonates with you, if you believe in honoring the unsung, in lifting up those who never ask for applause, then subscribe to my stories channel. We celebrate the heroes who don't celebrate themselves, because real honor doesn't need applause, but it deserves recognition. Your mission is simple. Find the Walter Hughes in your life. Sit with him. Listen to him. Thank him.